It began in the year 2009, during a deployment that should have been like any other. A standard rotation, a calm zone, at least on the surface. The unit had settled into routine operations at a remote military outpost surrounded by dense, fog-heavy forests. Days passed with the usual drills, patrols, and monotonous duties, until one evening, a sealed envelope was found on the desk of the unit's commanding officer. It was plain, without a return address, insignia, or stamp. The envelope was made of old yellowing paper, and the handwriting on the front was oddly precise, as if written with a ruler and no human warmth. The officer opened it, read the contents, and fell quiet. No explanation was offered, just a briefing the next morning. A mission had come in, off the record, but urgent. The task was to travel deep into the forest to a small village that had reportedly been abandoned for decades. Satellite imagery showed no activity, no heat signatures, no power grid, but a local shepherd had claimed to see movement there just weeks earlier. Not just lights, but shadowy figures, walking stiffly through the fog. There had been no other reports, and no follow-ups from intelligence agencies. Still, the orders were clear. The squad was to investigate, secure the village, and report back. But what disturbed the men most wasn't the strange location or the secrecy. It was the message inside the envelope. Only one sentence had been written, centered on the page in black ink. Secure the village. Do not speak of what you see. Despite the unease, the mission proceeded as ordered. At dusk, the soldiers packed their gear and boarded 2 armored transport vehicles. As they entered the forest, the air grew colder, and the sunlight vanished behind a wall of trees so thick it felt like night had come early. The fog began to roll in as the vehicles moved deeper into the forest. At first light and thin, then heavy enough to obscure vision completely. Branches scratched against the windows, and the only sound was the rumble of engines and the occasional rustle of something moving just beyond sight. None of them spoke much. A few jokes were made in hushed tones, the way soldiers do when tension builds too high, but no one really laughed. Even the radio chatter from base turned faint, full of static, before cutting out completely. It wasn't jammed. It was just dawn. Eventually, after more than 2 hours of crawling through the forest, the vehicles came to a stop at the edge of a clearing. There it was, the village. It sat quiet, like something from an old photograph. Small, crumbling houses with sagging white roofs, crooked fences, and overgrown paths covered in moss. No signs of life, no dogs barking, no lights from windows, just stillness. Time seemed to have stopped in this place. What immediately struck the soldiers was that every single house had its door wide open. Not one, not two, all of them. Doors, ajar, like the village had been left in a hurry, or as if something had passed through and opened each one intentionally. The squad dismounted and moved forward, weapons ready. The air felt wrong, not just cold, but heavy, like walking underwater. Some of the men reported feeling dizzy. One even stopped to lean against a tree, saying his vision was blurring. Still, they pressed on. The commander gave the order to sweep the village, house by house. Each soldier entered a different structure. Inside, the homes looked lived in, but old. Dust covered everything, but there were plates on the tables, toys on. The floors, even coats still hanging by the doors. It was as if the people who once lived there had simply stood up one day and walked away without packing a thing. One soldier opened a cupboard and found a bowl of rotted fruit, completely untouched by mold. Another checked a bedroom and found a rocking chair still gently moving, even though the windows were closed and there was no breeze. The village had power at one point, but the wires had been cut cleanly. Not frayed, not torn. Cut. As the sweep continued, the squad regrouped in the center of the village, unsettled by what they'd found. There were no signs of life, but also no signs of natural decay beyond dust. It was unnatural, too preserved. That was when Private Lorne pointed toward the well near the center of the village. It was old, made of cracked stone, and its wooden cover was half broken, as if someone had forced it open from below. There was no rope, no bucket, just a black hole leading down into nothing. Curiosity and protocol demanded an inspection, so one of the men took a flashlight and leaned over to look in. The beam vanished into darkness. It didn't hit anything. There was no sound of the light touching water, no echo, just endless black. The squad stood around the well for a few silent moments. Then, without warning, the ground beneath them seemed to vibrate ever so slightly. Not a quake, just a thrum, like the pulse of something alive. Then came the sound. Faint at first, almost like the moaning of wind through the trees. But it grew louder, and then the realization hit. It wasn't wind. It was voices, dozens of them, screaming. From beneath the well, the screams were human, desperate, terrified, and constant, like a loop of people dying again and again. The man who had leaned over the well stumbled back, pale as ash. He claimed he had seen a face looking back at him, pale skin, dark hollow, eyes and a mouth that never moved, just hung open wide. He swore the face whispered something, just one word, clear and cold in his ear. Stay. Panic started to rise. The squad formed a perimeter around the well, but the noise had stopped. Again, replaced by silence so deep it hurt the ears. Radios clicked with static. Then, through the static, came whispers. At first, unintelligible, then clearer. It was their own voices, screaming, calling out for help in ways that none of them had ever heard before, but they knew it was them. Not from now, from past missions, from old nightmares. Memories that were never recorded anywhere, suddenly echoing back from the deep. What was this place? They had come to secure a village. But what they had walked into felt more like a trap that had been waiting for years, for someone to come back. Night fell quickly over the village, almost unnaturally so. The last light of the sun vanished behind the treetops far too early, and with it came a cold that bit through the soldiers' uniforms and settled in their bones. The squad set up a temporary command post in the largest house, once a town hall or gathering place, judging by its size and structure. It had wide wooden floors, peeling wallpaper, and a long table in the center that still held cracked mugs and an old radio. Long, dead. The squad leader, Captain Rourke, decided to wait for dawn before trying to leave. The forest had become too thick with fog, the paths too dark, and the radios remained nothing but static. No backup would come. The plan was to rest in shifts, monitor the area, and move out at first light. But the village had other plans. Inside the house, the soldiers tried to keep calm. Some cleaned weapons, some ate in silence, chewing mechanically, the food tasting like ash. Others paced. Private Lorne sat near a window, eyes fixed on the well outside. He hadn't spoken since the face appeared to him, and though his body remained still, his lips moved sometimes, forming words that made no sense. Sergeant Mendez lit a cigarette, even though smoking indoors was forbidden during missions. At that moment, rules no longer seemed to matter. Something about the place made it feel like they weren't under the same sky anymore. The normal world, its rules, its time, its structure, felt far away. Gone. The first sign that something was deeply wrong came just past midnight. A loud crash echoed from one of the other houses, a wooden door slamming shut violently. The squad rushed outside with weapons drawn, flashlights cutting through the thick fog. The door to one of the smaller homes stood closed. The strange thing was, it had been open earlier, like all the others. No wind could have shut it. The house itself looked darker than the others, almost as if it absorbed the light rather than reflected it. Captain Rourke approached with two men, kicked the door open and swept inside. The house was empty. Dust floated through the air. A single chair rocked gently in the middle of the room, as if someone had just stood up from it. Then the second sound came, this time from the forest's edge. A crunch of leaves. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, just outside the fog line. Lights swung in that direction, but nothing showed. The fog was too thick. The steps stopped. Not because someone paused, but as if whoever was walking had simply vanished. Then, moments later, footsteps came from the opposite side. Closer, heavier. Breathing could be heard, ragged and wet, just beyond visibility. Not human breathing. Something deeper. Hungrier. The squad fell back, returned to the main building, and sealed the doors. Windows were boarded. Defensive positions were set up. No one slept. The hours dragged on like years, the clocks refusing to move. Lorne began whispering to himself more urgently, his voice taking on an odd, low rhythm. He said the same word over and over, repeat, repeat, repeat. When asked what he meant, he looked up, eyes vacant, and said, "This already happened. We're just the next ones." Then, as if summoned by those words, a deep hum filled the air. Not mechanical, not electrical. It sounded alive, like the purring of some giant thing hiding beneath the earth. The floorboards began to vibrate. The walls pulsed like lungs, as if the entire house was breathing. And then the worst part came. Not the sound, not the fog, not even the strange phenomena. It was the smell. It began as a faint sourness in the DZ. Air, but quickly grew stronger, like rotting meat left under the sun for days. The stench forced one soldier to vomit. Others gagged and covered their faces with cloth. It wasn't just unpleasant. It triggered something primal, something buried deep inside the mind that screamed, "Leave this place now." But they couldn't. The path back was gone. Literally. When one soldier tried to walk back down the path through which they had entered the village, he returned minutes later, dazed and pale. He hadn't taken any turns, hadn't strayed from the trail. But somehow, he ended up back at the well. Time didn't work here. Distance didn't obey logic. They were trapped inside something that pretended to be a village, but wasn't, and then, just before dawn, when the sky should have begun to lighten, a scream tore through the air. Not from one of the soldiers. It came from every direction at once. Male, female, old, young. It wasn't just one voice. It was dozens, hundreds, a chorus of agony. The sound bounced off the trees and the fog, never fading, never stopping. Every soldier dropped to the ground, covering ears, eyes wide with terror. It wasn't just sound. It was pressure, like the scream itself had weight. Bones vibrated under it, teeth ached. Blood felt slower in the veins. When the scream finally stopped, the fog began to clear just enough to reveal movement. Shapes walked out of the trees. Not fast, not charging, just drifting. Human shapes, but wrong. Limbs too long, heads tilted, at impossible angles. Skin pale, almost translucent, stretched too tightly over their bones. And their mouths hung open, not speaking, not moving, just wide, as if in a constant silent scream. They stopped just at the edge of the village, and stood there. Captain Rourke gave no orders. He stared out the window, jaw clenched, sweat pouring down his face. No strategy could apply here. No plan worked in a place that ignored the rules of the living world. All that could be done was to survive until light, or whatever passed for morning in this cursed place. But morning never came. Time had stopped in the village, and whatever had awakened from beneath the ground was just beginning to show itself. The well, silent now, still stood in the center like an open wound. The air around it seemed darker, heavier. And Lorne? He simply sat near the window, smiling now, whispering calmly, "It's starting again." The day, if it could be called that, stretched on endlessly. The soldiers could feel time warping around them, bending like a broken clock whose hands refused to move forward. No one dared to sleep, though exhaustion clung to them like an unseen weight. Every moment was spent waiting for something they could not define, but knew was coming. The village felt alive with an unnatural stillness, a watching presence that made their skin crawl. The figures from the trees were gone, but they hadn't left. The soldiers could feel their eyes on them, though no one spoke of it aloud. The fog that had initially seemed like a natural occurrence now felt more like a veil, a barrier separating them from the outside world. The eerie hum beneath the ground had returned, vibrating through the floors, the walls, and the very air around them. It wasn't just in the house anymore. It was in everything, as though the entire village was breathing, and they were trapped in its chest. Captain Rourke, now more a shell of a man than a leader, paced the house's front room. He had been a soldier for over 15 years, seen combat on foreign soil, dealt with the worst horrors the world had to offer, but nothing had prepared him for this. This place, this village, was different. No enemy had ever been like this. The soldiers weren't sure what it was they faced. Was it supernatural? A secret weapon? Some unknown biological phenomenon? The possibilities were too many, and none of them felt safe to consider. There were too many questions and too few answers. One thing was certain, though. There was no escape. The decision was made. They had to leave. The squad couldn't stay here any longer. They couldn't wait for the dawn that had never come. The moment Captain Rourke gave the order to move, Private Lorne went still, his eyes wide with fear. He whispered, more to himself than anyone else, "It's already too late. They'll never let us go." The words weren't just strange, they were chilling. He hadn't spoken much in the last several hours, but when he did speak, it wasn't with the clarity of the man. They had known. Something had happened to him. He wasn't the same. No one knew exactly what had changed, but something about him felt off. He wasn't acting like the soldier they'd deployed with, and his behavior was growing increasingly erratic. Mendez, ever the skeptic, scoffed at Lorne's words, but even he couldn't deny the growing sense of dread that hung over them all. There had been enough strange occurrences, enough unexplainable events, to make him reconsider his disbelief. The air felt heavier now, thick with the weight of something oppressive. Each step they took outside, heading for the transport vehicles, felt like they were wading through treacle, their limbs slow and sluggish. The fog hadn't lifted. If anything, it had thickened, swirling around them as if alive, swallowing up everything in its path. The further they ventured from the house, the more their surroundings seemed to shift, as if the village itself was a labyrinth designed to trap them. They reached the vehicles, but something was wrong. They hadn't made it far when the unmistakable sound of footsteps, too many footsteps, reached their ears. Not human footsteps. These were heavy, wet, dragging steps, like something large and unwieldy was moving through the mist. They turned around, and there, emerging from the dense fog, was a shape. It was difficult to see at first, but as it came closer, its form became clearer. The soldiers froze. The shape was humanoid, but twisted. Its body was unnaturally long, its limbs bent at odd angles. The face that emerged from the shadows was pale, eyes sunken and lifeless, as if it had been pulled from the grave. Its mouth, twisted and malformed, hung open, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth that clacked together as if gnashing in hunger. The creature didn't move like a human. It didn't even move like an animal. It was as if it was driven by something otherworldly, a force beyond the understanding of mere mortals. For a long moment, no one moved. The soldiers stood frozen, staring at the creature, unsure of what to do. It was a beast, yes, but not one that could be fought with weapons. It was a grotesque mockery of life itself, something not meant for this world. And then, as though sensing their hesitation, it lunged. The soldiers were faster than the creature, diving for cover, raising their weapons. Gunfire rang out, but the bullets seemed to do nothing. The thing kept coming, its movements jerky and unpredictable. For every shot that hit, another wound healed, and the creature was no closer to stopping. It was relentless, an unnatural force pushing forward. Mendez, who had been one of the first to fire, shouted for everyone to fall back. "This isn't working!" he screamed, but his voice barely made it past his lips. There was no time. The squad scrambled to get into the vehicles, but the creature was already there, standing directly in their path, blocking the way. More shapes began to emerge from the fog, more of them, crawling from the edges of the village, emerging from the darkness, converging on the soldiers like a swarm. No one had seen them until they were already too close. The captain shouted an order, his voice shaky. They had to get out of here. There was no hope of fighting them all off. "Move out!" he barked. The soldiers piled into the vehicles, their hands trembling as they fumbled with the controls. One of the men, the youngest of the squad, had already lost his nerve. He was shaking so badly that he couldn't start his vehicle. He never had the chance to. One of the creatures reached inside, dragging him out and disappearing into the mist with him in tow. His scream echoed through the village, but no one dared to look back. The rest of the squad peeled out of the village, engines roaring, tires skidding over wet, uneven ground. The moment they left the village, the hum beneath them ceased. The fog began to thin, and the dense forest once again appeared. But it didn't feel like the same world. It was as if the village had never been there at all, as if it had never existed. The soldiers couldn't look at each other. The images of the creatures, the shrieks, and the overwhelming sense of wrongness hung in their minds like a curse they couldn't shake. They had escaped, yes, but they hadn't won. They hadn't found answers, and they had lost one of their own. Captain Rourke stared ahead through the windshield, his hands clenched tightly around the steering wheel. He had no idea where they were going now, but it didn't matter. The mission was over. There would be no reporting back. The village had won. It had claimed them all, and in the end, it would never let them go. The vehicles sped through the forest, the tires crunching over the uneven, wet ground. The fog had finally begun to dissipate, but the heavy silence that followed in its wake felt heavier than any sound. Inside the lead vehicle, Captain Rourke's hands trembled as they gripped the steering wheel. His mind raced with thoughts of the soldiers lost, of the things they had seen in the village. He couldn't make sense of it. No military training, no battle experience had prepared him for whatever had happened there. The creatures, those twisted things that had emerged from the fog, haunted him, their hollow eyes, their twisted limbs. The rest of the squad sat in a stunned silence, each man lost in his own thoughts, some staring blankly ahead, others looking out the windows. But no one spoke. No one could speak. What was there to say? They had lost a comrade. They had barely escaped with their lives. And yet, in the back of their minds, they all knew they were not safe. Whatever had started in that village was far from over. As the vehicles wound their way deeper into the forest, the landscape outside began to change. The trees thinned, replaced by an open stretch of land that was eerily flat and desolate. In the distance, the sound of running water could be heard, but it wasn't enough to break the tension in the air. The only sounds inside the vehicles were the occasional cough or the shifting of bodies. The fog seemed to follow them, creeping, along the edges of their vision, clinging to the trees like a dark, malevolent cloud. It wasn't natural. No one said it aloud, but every man in that vehicle could feel the weight of the unease, the sense that something was watching them. As they approached a small bridge, Captain Rourke finally broke the silence. "We need to check the road ahead," he said in a low voice, though his words seemed forced, as if he were trying to convince himself more than anyone else. He signaled for the vehicles to stop, and the squad disembarked, their boots sinking into the damp earth. The air was thick, and the faint smell of decay lingered, though the more they moved, the stronger the scent became. It wasn't just the village anymore. The whole area stank of rot, of something that had been dead too long. The men stood in the middle of the road, scanning the horizon. The bridge was old, weathered with age, its wooden planks creaking under the weight of their boots. The river below gurgled softly, but there was no sign of movement on the other side. The world felt still, but it was the kind of stillness that made every man's skin crawl, as though the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting. One soldier, Corporal Haynes, pointed out something strange. In the distance across the bridge, there was a shape moving through the trees, too large to be an animal, and not the right shape for a human. At first, it appeared to be a shadow, an outline among the trees, but as they watched, it became clearer. The shape was humanoid, tall and unnaturally thin, with limbs that seemed to stretch and bend in ways they shouldn't. The figure moved slowly, but its movement was jerky, as if it wasn't fully in sync with the world around it. Haynes raised his weapon, but Captain Rourke quickly lowered it. "No," he said quietly. "We need to move forward. Don't engage unless absolutely necessary." The rest of the squad nodded, though it was clear they were all hesitant. They crossed the bridge in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. The trees on the other side of the river seemed to close in around them as they moved, deeper into the woods, the fog still creeping along the edges of their vision. It was as though the world around them was distorting, warping into something unnatural. The path ahead twisted and turned, the trees growing closer together, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the light. It felt as if they had entered another realm, one where time had no meaning, and the normal rules of the world no longer applied. By now, the soldiers had moved as quietly as possible, the tension palpable in the air. Every crack of a twig underfoot, every rustle of leaves felt like a threat. It wasn't the sounds of the forest they were afraid of, but the silence in between, the unnatural stillness that followed them. They couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that eyes, countless eyes, were following their every move. It was the kind of fear that gnawed at the edges of the mind, the kind that turned every shadow into a potential threat. After what felt like hours, they arrived at a clearing. It was unnaturally quiet here, the silence so thick it felt suffocating. In the middle of the clearing stood a large stone monument, covered in moss and vines, its surface slick with dampness. Strange symbols were carved into the stone, their meaning lost to time. The soldiers gathered around the monument, examining it warily. It wasn't just an artifact of the forest, it was something more. A marker, perhaps. A symbol of something ancient, something that didn't belong. Captain Rourke stared at the monument, his mind racing. He didn't understand what it meant, but he could feel the danger radiating from it. Then it happened. A rustling sound came from behind them. One by one, the men turned, their weapons raised, eyes scanning the trees. Out of the corner of his eye, Captain Rourke saw something that froze his blood. It wasn't a figure in the distance, it was closer, much closer. In the shadows of the trees, a pair of glowing eyes watched them. They were the same eyes, the same hollow, empty gaze they had seen in the village. The creatures had followed them. Suddenly, the air around them grew cold, and the humming sound returned, louder this time, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. The fog thickened, swirling around them like a living thing. And from the mist, the figures emerged again. More of them, appearing from the edges of the clearing, walking slowly, deliberately. Their movements were jerky, like broken marionettes, and their eyes never blinked, never wavered. They were coming closer. Captain Rourke's heart pounded in his chest as he raised his weapon. The squad didn't need an order. They were all ready, running, sprinting through the trees, moving with a primal fear that they couldn't control. But no matter how fast they ran, no matter how hard they pushed, the The creatures stayed with them, closing in like shadows, faster than they should have been. And then the ground gave way beneath them. The soldiers fell, tumbling into a pit. Some hit the ground hard, others managed to scramble for footing. But as they looked up, they realized they had fallen into the center of the village once more. The mist surrounded them, thick as ever. The creatures were waiting, and the village had swallowed them whole. They hadn't escaped. They were back, trapped in the same cycle, the same nightmare. The village had claimed them, and they would never leave.